All right, so we have inflation, GDP growth rate, and GDP. So as we can see right here with inflation, it's been very steady for the past about 60 years. The graph starts at 1950, ends at 2010. We have an average increase of 0.1%, which is not very bad at all. It's not like we're increasing like 5% or anything like that. For GDP growth rate, this definitely catches everyone's eye right here. This is 2008, 2009-ish, which is when the U.S. housing market just completely crashed, and we all know that that affected everyone worldwide with European markets, especially Germany. Now, that didn't affect Germany overall for GDP, starting in 1970, ending in 2016. The GDP overall for Germany is 5.42% of the world's economy, and in 2014, our highest GDP was almost $4 trillion, and $3.8 trillion. And overall, doing pretty good for ourselves.
So right here we have a graph of the German unemployment rate going from 1995 to 2016. In 1995, the unemployment rate was a little bit above 5%, and it's gone down to 4.11% in 2016. Overall, there's been a decreasing trend, except for a few spikes in 1997, where it was just around 10%, in 2005, where it got all the way up to 11%. Right now, it's the fifth lowest unemployment in the world for 2016, and employment has been at its highest since German reunification. This is partly attributed to the employment rate among women being up 10% since 2005, which is when we had the big spike, bringing employment among women up to 73%.
Okay, so Germany is pretty much set up to be one of the great trade powers in the entire world. Ever since the reunification, they've been steadily increasing in their industrial power and how good they are at manufacturing. So that's pretty much reflected in this graph here. So this is international trade since 1995 all the way up to 2015. And as you can see, Germany is doing pretty well. They got up to around 1.4 trillion in exports and about 1 trillion in imports. And what this pretty much shows is even as we go through different economic cycles, the exports generally stay the same distance above the imports, which means they're going to have a trade surplus, which means they're probably going to bring in more revenue than they're going to spend out. And since Germany is so industrial in nature, their exports are more like car parts, cars, and more general manufacturing. And it's kind of the same thing for their imports. They import a lot of cars, they import car parts, and they also import a lot of petroleum. And then they also export and import large amounts of medicinal goods. But as you can see here, all that pretty much adds up to this little notion right here that since their exports are so much greater than their imports, that's going to lead to a trade surplus. And what that means is they're just going to have more revenue than the money they're spending out into the world. So although that may not be great now that the Eurozone is collapsing and Brexit happened, it looks like Germany's going to be okay when they're looking after their own self-interest. So we can see that Germany may be self-sufficient in the near future if they continue to keep up this trade deficit. But so long as other manufacturers such as China and the US and France and the Netherlands, surprisingly, keep up their exports, Germany will be able to keep up this low level of imports compared to their exports.
Guten Abend, ich bin hier mit ihm, das Foreign Exchange Market zu sprechen. So, Germany's foreign exchange market, the EWG ETF, a $10,000 initial investment will triple in the long run. Its top 4 players are still, for the most part, on a long-term increase, and so further research yields that some of them, such as the industrials like BASF and Allianz, which is a financial big player in the ETF, are on a slight decrease, but in the long term, they have had a steadily increasing graph. There is also a favorable exchange rate. So about 5-10 years ago, it was 0.71, and at this point the ratio of the US dollar to the euro is 0.89. And so the rising exchange rate is good for the German economy. On the flip side, for us foreign investors over here looking to benefit from the exchange rate, it's a good time to get on that train now, because with the aforementioned trade surplus in Germany, means that the euro is going to get stronger because of the German economy's success in the long term, but that higher exchange rate is going to make it less lucrative for us Americans to invest in the ETF. So I would get on that train now while you can. We were discussing the weak euro just earlier. The weak euro and the weakened eurozone does make it so that the German economy is fragile. It is susceptible to world economic dynamics, as we saw earlier with Dylan's discussion of the GDP growth rate and how that tanked in 2008 with the housing bubble that happened in the US, and that affected the world economy. So it is fragile. There is that. It is, as I said before in speaking about the top 4 players, ETF's components are susceptible to slight downturns in economic activity, slight pitfalls in returns, but in the long term it has been experiencing a slow growth and is a solid long-term investment. Alright, so based on all the stuff that Blake talked about and Pat talked about and Dylan talked about, inflation, GDP rate, GDP growth rate, and unemployment, as well as trade, as well as the foreign exchange market, we highly suggest, that in the long term, you discuss with your investor a possible investment in the EWG ETF. It is lucrative, it is an excellent long-term decision, and we think your portfolio will benefit from it. Danke für uns hören und unser Film sehen. Tschüssi!